I stood at the edge of my own silence, not a silence born of peace or tranquility, but one that arises after the last protest has fallen from the lips, after every plea has grown hoarse and weary from its own echo. It was a silence that pressed down upon me like ancient stone, not imposed by the world, but birthed from the collapse within. The city around me continued its rhythm. Donkeys brayed, vendors argued over coin and measure, children dashed through dust chasing their own laughter. But to me, it all felt distant, like the flickering remnants of a dream already fading. I moved through those streets as though wrapped in thick cloth, my feet touching the ground but never really arriving. In truth, I had not arrived anywhere in many months. I was there, and yet not truly there. My body remained in Kanya, walking, sitting, eating, speaking, but my spirit drifted elsewhere, cloaked in a fog I could neither describe nor disperse. There had been no single moment of collapse, no clear blow that brought me to my knees. It was more like erosion, a slow, steady wearing away of certainty, joy, and meaning. Troubles had not arrived with fanfare. They crept in through the back door, disguised as minor inconveniences, quiet sorrows, small griefs that at first seemed manageable. But grief, I've come to learn, is a patient sculptor. It chisels daily, softly, subtly, until one morning you wake and realize that the person you were no longer stands where you left them. I had once been a man who believed he could master his world with clarity and effort. I studied, prayed, taught, walked in wisdom. But as I grew older, life taught me a different language, one not of mastery, but of mystery. And I, who had once spoken in certainties, now found myself tongued with doubt. What troubled me most was not just the pain I carried, but the fact that I did not understand why it persisted. I had done what I was taught. I had loved God. I had sought justice. I had offered charity and prayer. Yet still, sorrow followed me like a shadow at high noon. I would close my eyes at night and whisper to the ceiling, "Why me? What more must I do?" And each time, silence answered back, not cruelly, not unkindly, but with the vast, unmoving stillness of the sky itself. Some nights I wept quietly beneath my robe. Others, I sat in numbness, my heart a cold stone in my chest. I found myself drawn to solitude more and more, not because I desired it, but because I felt unfit for the presence of others. What could I offer anyone while carrying such unseen burdens? I feared my brokenness would leak into them, that my unrest might disturb their peace. There was a time, not so long ago, when I believed troubles were meant to be overcome, like obstacles in a race. I wore them as challenges, thinking my resolve could break through. I fought against them, resisted them, buried them beneath clever words and sacred texts. I told myself they were temporary, that soon I would rise above them and return to the man I once was. But weeks turned to months, and that return never came. Instead, the struggle itself became a kind of cage, forged not by the trouble itself, but by my refusal to allow it to speak. I did not want to hear what it had to say. I wanted it gone. Then one day, as I wandered outside the city, I found myself standing before a tree whose branches had been broken by a recent storm. The trunk leaned sideways, half upright, scarred and cracked, yet still it held its ground. I ran my hand along the bark and felt the rough truth of it. This tree had suffered and had not perished. It had accepted the violence of the wind, the unkindness of fate, and still remained. There was a kind of nobility in its posture, wounded, yes, but not ashamed. I remember sitting beneath that tree for what felt like hours, staring at its scars as if they were sacred texts. I could not explain it, but something shifted in me. Not relief, not joy, but the faintest breath of permission. Permission to be broken. Permission to stop pretending. Permission, perhaps, to finally listen to the trouble rather than continue waging war against it. That night I dreamed again of the door. I had seen it before, tall, wooden, ancient, etched with symbols whose meaning slipped just beyond the reach of language. I was alone in a vast corridor of light and shadow, and before me stood that door, silent and unmoving. Again, I tried to open it. I pushed with all the strength my dream body could muster. I kicked, screamed, wept, begged. But the door did not yield. Then, at the edge of my exhaustion, I heard something I hadn't noticed before, breathing. Not my own. From the other side. Someone, something, was there, waiting. But not for force. Not for rage. It waited with stillness. As I knelt in front of the door, spent and breathless, I heard the faintest voice. Not a whisper, not even sound, but something like a presence inside my bones. It said, "The door opens not with struggle. It opens when you stop trying to open it." I woke with my heart pounding, not from fear, but from recognition. All at once, I understood that I had been trying to escape my troubles rather than understand them. I had been treating them like invaders, not messengers. Perhaps they carried something I needed, some unspoken truth, some necessary unraveling. Perhaps the door I stood before was not meant to be conquered, but approached with humility. And perhaps, just perhaps, the key had never been elsewhere. Perhaps it was within me all along, waiting for me to stop forcing my way through and simply stand still enough to let it open. I did not speak of this to anyone. Not yet. Some understandings are too fragile for immediate speech. They must be held gently, like a bird cupped in the palms. And so I held it, trembling but whole, this fragile knowing that I had been wrong about the nature of my troubles. They were not punishments. They were invitations. Not to battle, but to listen. Not to escape, but to soften. And for the first time in what felt like years, I did not resist them. I let the ache sit beside me like an old friend, no longer chased away. I watched the door in my heart, still closed, but now no longer locked. Something had shifted, imperceptible but real. The struggle had paused. And in that stillness, I began to sense the earliest breath of a new beginning. The evening had unfurled itself with a quiet majesty, the kind of slow beauty that demands no attention and yet arrests the soul when seen. The sun, in its descent, spilled long rivers of gold across the horizon, and the sky opened like a wound, tender and raw with colors, amber, crimson, violet, all mingling in silence. I found myself drawn toward the old plane tree, as if pulled by an invisible thread woven through the fabric of my being. This was not a place I visited lightly. It stood just beyond the edge of the city's whisper, in a field where time moved differently, slower, deeper, more honest. I had passed it many times before, but on this day, my feet turned toward it without conscious thought. Perhaps it was the weight I carried in my chest, the questions that clung to my ribs like thorns, or the exhaustion that no sleep had cured. Whatever it was, I walked toward that tree like a man returning to something ancient, something sacred. The closer I came, the more I felt the stillness expand around me, as though the tree itself radiated a gravity that pulled my thoughts into silence. It stood tall but weathered, its bark cracked and furrowed like the face of a sage who has outlived empires. Its branches, some broken, reached into the sky like arms that no longer sought to grasp but simply bore witness. I approached it slowly, almost reverently, and sat down at its base, leaning back into its gnarled trunk. The wood was cool against my back, and the ground beneath me was uneven with roots that seemed to rise just enough to remind me that something ancient stirred beneath the soil. I sat for a long while without speaking, without even thinking in full sentences, only fragments, feelings, sensations. The breeze moved gently through the tall grass, and the leaves above rustled with a music older than any song I had ever heard. The city, the noise, the expectations of others, the turmoil inside me, they all faded until I was left with just the hum of being. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, I felt myself sink into the moment without resistance. There was no agenda, no demand to be wise, no need to fix anything. I simply sat, and the tree allowed me to. My hand rested on one of the thick roots that coiled out from the base like fingers half buried in the earth. The bark was worn smooth in places, rough in others, and I let my palm move across its surface slowly. This root had grown beneath countless storms, had been soaked in rain, cracked in drought, slept under snow. Yet it remained. Not because it had fought the weather, but because it had absorbed it, accepted it, allowed it to shape and harden it without becoming bitter. It had not run from the wind, it had let the wind teach it how to bend. In that moment, I saw how much I had misunderstood my own troubles. I had treated each hardship as an opponent, something to outmaneuver, overcome, or ignore. I had armed myself with knowledge, with prayer, with poetry, thinking these would shield me from life's injuries. But the tree had no such armor. Its wisdom lay not in evasion, but in presence. A sadness rose in me then, not a dramatic sorrow, but a deep, quiet ache. It was the sadness of realizing how long I had been at war with life, even while seeking the divine. I had mistaken resistance for strength. I had thought that if I refused to be shaken, if I held tight to what I believed I was owed, peace, answers, clarity, then I would be safe. But I was not safe. I was tired. Tired of pretending to be unshakable, tired of fighting the same shadows, tired of questioning why suffering chose me when I had done all I could to walk the path of righteousness. And in that weariness, something in me cracked, just slightly, and through that crack came not despair, but light. I took a deep breath, the kind that draws not only air but the whole of one's being into the lungs. I let it out slowly, and with it, I exhaled the years of resistance, the tight grip of control, the belief that I must always have answers. And as the breath left me, I whispered into the quiet, maybe this is not a punishment. Maybe this is a passage. The words surprised me. They felt like they had not come from me, but through me, as though the tree or the earth or the silence had spoken them and I had merely echoed them. And the moment they left my lips, I felt a loosening in the very center of my chest, as if something long clenched had finally released. The troubles I had carried, grief over loss, confusion over purpose, the ache of separation, the guilt of not being enough, they did not vanish. But they changed shape. They became less like weights and more like lanterns. I saw how each had burned away parts of me that could not survive the fire. How each had left behind not ashes, but space. Space for softness. Space for surrender. I began to understand that perhaps I was not being broken to be punished, but to be made spacious enough to hold something larger. That perhaps the crack in the vessel is not the end of its use, but the beginning of its transformation. The light through the branches shifted, turning the grass around me into rivers of shadow and flame. And I, still sitting in the arms of the tree, whispered again, this time not in pain, but in wonder, what if I stop running? What if I stop resisting and begin to listen? The question did not demand an answer. It opened like a flower in the dark. I felt my eyes close without my command, and in the space behind my eyelids I saw the door again, the same door from my dream, tall and old, etched with ancient symbols. But this time, I did not approach it with fists. I simply stood before it, bare and breathing. And I knew, without words, that the door did not open from force. It opened from stillness, from presence, from the quiet courage to remain. When I opened my eyes, the world had deepened. Night was beginning to press its velvet fingers across the sky, and stars flickered softly above, hesitant but arriving. I remained where I was, unwilling to disturb the holiness of that moment. The tree beneath me held me like a cradle. The wind moved through my hair like a benediction. And I, a man who had searched far and wide for meaning, sat beneath a tree and discovered that meaning was not something I could chase. It was something I could only receive when I stopped demanding life be otherwise. The troubles I had been given had not changed, but something in me had. And in that shift, subtle yet immense, I felt it, the faint creaking of a door long shut beginning to yield. Not open, not yet, but yield. And for the first time, that was enough. I no longer needed the door to open all at once. I only needed to sit quietly and trust that it would, when I stopped asking it to. when I accepted that the door had been waiting not for my power, but for my presence. The walk back from the tree that evening had felt different, though the path was the same I had taken countless times before. The stones underfoot were familiar, the winding curves of the road, the small dips where rainwater would collect after a storm, all of it unchanged. And yet, something had shifted. It wasn't the path that was different. It was the one walking it. I was still carrying my burdens, yes, griefs that clung like a second skin, regrets that echoed like old songs in the distance, questions that had not been answered. But for the first time in a long while, I was not fighting them. I was simply carrying them, without resistance, without argument. They were no longer weights chained to my ankles dragging me into the earth. They were shapes I held in my hands, able to be turned over and examined in the light. There was a strange relief in that. To no longer hide from what hurt, but to walk with it, like a companion whose presence was not welcomed, but accepted. I remember entering my study that night with a strange quiet in my chest, not the silence of emptiness, but of spaciousness. It was as though something that had once been tightly coiled around my ribs had begun to unravel. I sat on the floor rather than at the table, the way children do when they play, and leaned against the wall, staring at the single flame of the oil lamp. That tiny flicker danced, alive and vulnerable, throwing shadows that stretched and shifted with every breath of wind. I watched it like one watches the surface of water, not because it holds answers, but because it reflects back the mystery of your own soul. I had prayed many times in that room. I had cried out to the heavens, pleaded for healing, begged for the pain to stop. I had spoken with fervor and eloquence, composing verses even in my sorrow. But that night, I prayed without words. I let the silence between me and the beloved speak for itself. There was nothing left to say. I simply breathed. Each inhale felt like a renewal, and each exhale like a surrender. I closed my eyes and laid my palms face up on the floor. I had read once that this posture was a gesture of receiving. I didn't know what I was asking to receive, peace, maybe, or clarity, or grace. But in that moment, it didn't matter. I was not asking for anything specific. I was simply letting go of the need to fight. And in that stillness, something began to stir within me. Not a voice. Not a vision, not even a thought. It was quieter than that. It was the slow dawning of a realization that had been waiting in the shadows of my suffering, patient and persistent. The realization that perhaps everything I had tried to avoid, the pain, the confusion, the ache of unanswered prayers, was not meant to be resisted. Perhaps it was meant to be felt. Fully. Without filter. Without shame. Without the constant narration of what it meant about me. I had spent so much of my life trying to interpret my pain, to give it meaning, to wrap it in spiritual language so that it wouldn't feel so sharp. But pain does not require interpretation. It only requires presence. And until now, I had not truly given it that. As I sat there, eyes closed, something softened deep within. I remembered moments I had tried to forget, the sting of loss, the burn of betrayal, the silent nights of longing where the stars seemed like cruel observers. I remembered the faces of those I loved who had departed, not just in death, but in absence, in distance, in silence. I remembered the days I had walked through the world smiling, while inside I was a crumbling temple. I had tried so hard to hold myself together, to be a source of strength for others, to be wise, to be good, to be useful. But beneath it all, I was just a soul trying to understand why life hurt so much. Tears came again, but they were not like before. They were not the hot, desperate tears of someone pleading for relief. They were cooler, quieter, tears of acknowledgement, of truth, of finally seeing what I had refused to see, that pain, when denied, becomes suffering. But pain, when allowed to breathe, becomes transformation. I let those tears fall freely, not wiping them away. Each one carried with it a piece of my resistance. Each one marked a moment of letting go. I stayed in that space for what must have been hours, unmoving, the lamp burning lower with each passing moment. The room grew darker, but I did not reach for another flame. I allowed the night to envelop me, as though it were a cloak I was finally willing to wear. And in that dark, I saw the image again. The door. Tall, weathered, immovable. I had dreamed of it many times before, always pushing, always trying to break through, always furious that it would not yield. But now, in this half-waking stillness, I stood before it differently. My fists were not clenched. My body was not braced to force it open. I simply stood there and watched it. And slowly, as if acknowledging my shift, the door shimmered, just slightly, like wood breathing in moonlight. I reached out, not to push, but to touch it gently. And the sensation that came was not hardness, not resistance, but warmth. The door was alive. It had been waiting for me to stop treating it like an enemy. It had never been locked. It had only required me to stop knocking with fear and begin approaching with reverence. The key had not been effort. It had been presence. I opened my eyes and found the room had gone almost entirely dark. The flame of the lamp had vanished, and yet I was not afraid. The darkness no longer felt like something pressing in, it felt like something embracing. Wrapping me in the truth that I no longer needed to resist what life had given me. I did not yet know what lay on the other side of the door. I did not need to know. It was enough that I had begun to see that the door itself was not my enemy. My suffering had not been a punishment. It had been a teacher. And though I had hated it, though I had cursed it and run from it and tried to silence its voice, I now began to bow to it. Not out of defeat, but out of gratitude. I would still have to walk through it. I would still have to face whatever waited beyond. But now, I would walk with a heart that was open, not guarded. I would carry my troubles like sacred texts, not burdens to hide. And I would remember, again and again, that the door had never truly been closed. It had only required me to accept what I had been given, to stop demanding a different life and begin honoring the one I already lived. That acceptance, I now understood, was not the end of my struggle, it was the beginning of my freedom. That night, after returning from the courtyard and laying my pen to rest, I remained seated on the floor of my room long after the lamp's flame had withered to a whisper. The darkness was not empty anymore. It was alive, full of breath and presence, like a sleeping friend beside me. I sat there with my knees drawn up to my chest, arms wrapped around them, forehead pressed to the space between. It was a posture I hadn't taken since I was a child, one of safety, of sheltering myself from a world too vast, too unpredictable. But now it was not fear that curled me into myself, it was reverence. Reverence for the stillness, for what I was learning, for what was slowly beginning to speak from the depths of silence. The room around me held its breath as if waiting for something to unfold. And within me, a memory stirred. Not a sharp one, not like a blade, but like a shadow returning from a long absence. I remembered the first time I had felt deeply troubled, not by an event, but by the sheer weight of existence. I had been no more than 14, standing in the garden of my family's home, watching an ant struggle beneath the weight of a dead leaf. I had followed it with my eyes for nearly half an hour, aching to help it, aching to understand what compelled such a small creature to persist under such a burden. I remember asking my father, why must things suffer? Why doesn't the world make it easier? And he, with his tired eyes and ever-practical voice, had said, because suffering is what teaches you to be strong. At the time, it sounded final, unquestionable. But now, decades later, I found myself questioning not the truth of his words, but the definition of strength itself. Had I misunderstood it all my life? Was strength truly about bearing burdens without breaking, or was it about allowing the burden to break you open, so that something new could rise from the fracture? I had resisted that possibility all my life. I had thought survival meant resisting the breaking. But now I saw that the breaking was not the end. It was a doorway. A hidden hinge that only revealed itself when I stopped pretending I could carry everything untouched. I stood slowly, stretching my limbs, and walked barefoot across the cold stone floor. The room was lit only by the dim shimmer of moonlight sneaking through the window lattice. I opened the shutters quietly, not to invite the light in, but to feel the night on my skin. The wind that greeted me was soft, and it carried with it the scent of jasmine from a nearby garden and the more distant smell of wood smoke. It was the kind of wind that doesn't ask anything of you. It simply brushes your cheeks and reminds you that you are alive. I closed my eyes and let it pass over me. There was no longer a need to search for meaning in every gust or whisper. I could just feel it, be present with it, without needing to wrap it in explanation. As I leaned against the frame of the window, I felt the night pressing against my back, vast and eternal. The stars above shimmered without urgency, without agenda. Their light was ancient, patient, unconcerned with my understanding. And in their quiet presence, I felt something loosen further within me. My troubles had always felt so personal, so specific, so sharpened by the blade of my own story. But under those stars, they felt like part of a much larger dance. A human rhythm. Everyone I had ever known, everyone who had walked these streets, spoken these prayers, cried these tears, they had all faced their own shadows, held their own silent griefs. And in that knowing, I no longer felt so alone. The next morning, I walked to the mosque not to teach, but to listen. I sat in the far corner, wrapped in my cloak, unnoticed by many. I watched the people as they came and went, some offering prayers with urgency, others with slow reverence, still others with distracted eyes, their minds elsewhere. I did not judge them. I simply watched. And I realized that each person was carrying their own invisible bundle. Some carried longing. Some carried guilt. Some carried fear wrapped carefully in the cloth of piety. And some, very few, carried peace. Not the peace that comes from a life without pain, but the peace that comes from no longer demanding that life be painless. A boy came to sit beside me at one point, no older than 10. He said nothing at first, only glanced at me and then looked straight ahead. After a while, he leaned in and whispered, "Do you think God hears us even when we don't say anything?" His eyes were wide, not with doubt, but with hope. I nodded. "Especially then," I said. He smiled, and then, as children do, left without another word. But in his question, I heard my own childhood echoing back to me. How many times had I feared that silence was a sign of divine absence? And now I was learning it was the very opposite. The silence was the presence. It was not a void, it was the space where truth revealed itself gently, slowly, patiently. As I walked home that day, I passed the same tree-lined path I had taken so many times before. The birds moved through the branches overhead, and a pair of doves cooed softly from a nearby rooftop. Nothing extraordinary happened. No vision, no revelation, no sudden enlightenment. Just the simple, quiet unfolding of presence. But that was its own miracle. I didn't need thunder to shake the sky or lightning to split it open. The door was opening slowly, imperceptibly, with each step I took toward it not in force, but in stillness. That night, as I prepared to sleep, I looked once more at my hands, these same hands that had written verses, buried loved ones, healed and hurt, clung and released. And I whispered to them, "Thank you for carrying me." For the first time, I felt gratitude not just for the joy, but for the struggle. For the days I could barely stand, for the moments I had wanted to disappear, for the nights I had questioned everything, I thanked them all. Because they had brought me here. To this threshold. To this quiet knowing that the door opens not when life gets easier, but when I stop resisting what life brings. I lay down, not seeking sleep, but inviting it. And as I closed my eyes, I felt as though the door was no longer something separate from me. It was within me. My chest, my breath, my being. And with every acceptance, every letting go, it opened just a little more. Not in great, swinging drama, but in the sacred creak of a soul no longer fighting itself. a door opening inward toward the light waiting patiently on the other side. The mornings gradually transformed into sacred rituals of quiet awakening. Before the first light of dawn broke the horizon, I found myself roused from slumber by an internal stirring, an invitation to meet the day not with haste or worry, but with reverence and presence. The air was always cool then, carrying the faint scent of dew-soaked earth and blooming jasmine, a reminder that even in darkness, life quietly stirs, preparing to unfold. In these liminal hours, when the world was still suspended between night and day, I discovered a rare and precious space within myself, a space free from the noise of judgment, free from the relentless chatter of my own mind. It was in this stillness that I began to observe the intricate patterns of my own suffering. Not with the eye of condemnation or despair, but with the gentle gaze of a gardener tending a delicate, fragile bloom. I saw how the stories I had woven around my pain, the endless whys and what-ifs, had become like vines, tangling around my heart and blurring my vision. I realized that these narratives, though born of truth, had become prisons in which I was trapped. They fed my longing to escape rather than my capacity to embrace. I understood that the first step toward freedom was not to change my troubles, but to change my relationship to them. In this light, I remembered a lesson from long ago, a potter shaping clay on his wheel, his hands both firm and yielding. The clay resisted, pushed back, and yet the potter did not fight it. He listened to its contours, allowed the friction and softness to guide his hands. This image illuminated the dance between my soul and suffering. I was not meant to conquer the pain, but to co-create with it. The troubles were not enemies to be vanquished, but forces that shaped me into the person I was becoming. Resistance hardened the clay, but acceptance softened and refined it. One sweltering afternoon, the marketplace bustled with life in ways both vibrant and chaotic. The calls of merchants mingled with the laughter of children, and the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer echoed down the narrow streets. Yet amidst this clamor, I found a stillness inside myself that felt new and fragile. As I passed a fountain, I saw a woman seated there, her eyes closed, tears slowly tracing the curves of her cheeks. Her grief was raw and unhidden, a quiet testament to the invisible struggles we all carry. I sat nearby without speaking, offering only the gift of presence. In that shared silence, I learned anew that sometimes words are not needed, that compassion can be held simply in the act of sitting alongside another's sorrow. As twilight deepened, I returned home and stood once again before the familiar door of my chamber. The wood was worn smooth from years of hands touching it in prayer and meditation. Tonight, I did not see the door as an obstacle, but as a friend waiting patiently for me to come home. I pressed my palm to its surface and felt the warmth of countless prayers absorbed by the grain. Leaning my forehead against it, I felt a profound connection, not just to the door, but to the journey it symbolized. The struggles, the doubts, the moments of despair, they were all threads in the tapestry that led me here, to this place of quiet hope. As night enveloped the city, I lay down to rest, a deep sense of gratitude rising within me. Not for the troubles themselves, they still lingered, their sharp edges softened but not gone, but for the way they had become my guides. Acceptance, I now understood, was not resignation but a brave act of embracing reality without denial. It was the moment when the heart ceases its battle and opens itself to listen, to the whisper of the divine, to the gentle voice within that speaks of healing and renewal. Sleep came softly, and with it dreams that did not flee from the pain but welcomed it, like shadows moving gracefully in the moonlight. I saw visions of doors swinging open slowly, light spilling through the smallest cracks, and a soul unfolding like the first petals of a flower greeting the dawn. When I awoke, the certainty that had settled in my heart was unwavering. The path ahead would remain challenging, but I was no longer alone or afraid. The door would open, not because I forced it, but because I had learned to welcome it with open arms and an open heart. Each day thereafter, I walked into the world carrying my troubles not as burdens but as sacred keys, keys that unlocked hidden chambers of wisdom and compassion within me. Every breath was an affirmation of this new way of being, every step a prayer of surrender and trust. The moment I accepted what troubles I had been given, I felt the door begin to open. And with patience and love, with faith and courage, it opened a little wider still, inviting me home into the fullness of life's mystery and grace. The days that followed unfolded gently, like a slow river carving its path through the earth, not with violence or haste, but with patient persistence. I awoke each morning with a quiet curiosity, eager not to escape my troubles but to meet them anew. The sun's first light spilled softly through my window, painting the walls in hues of gold and rose, and I would sit there still, breathing deeply, attuning myself to the rhythms of the world outside and the world within. In those moments of dawn, when everything is fresh and unspoiled by the cares of the day, I felt the delicate unfolding of acceptance take root in the soil of my heart. I began to notice how so much of my suffering had been compounded not by the troubles themselves, but by my relentless battle against them. I had been like a traveler dragging a heavy pack uphill, straining every muscle to resist the weight rather than adjusting my pace or resting when needed. That resistance had worn me down, left me ragged and weary. But now, with each morning's quiet meditation, I learned to loosen my grip. I gave myself permission to rest in the presence of my pain, to allow it to exist without judgment or fear. I was discovering that acceptance is not a one-time event, but a continuous, unfolding process. A breath in and a breath out, an opening and a softening, a dance between holding on and letting go. One afternoon, wandering through the lush garden behind the madrasa, I paused beside a rose bush heavy with blooms in varying stages of life. Some petals were vibrant and full of color, catching the sunlight like tiny flames. Others had begun to wither, curling at the edges and falling slowly to the earth. I found myself captivated by this cycle, the beauty intertwined with decay, the new life nourished by what had passed away. I understood then that my own troubles were like these petals, not failures or stains upon my soul, but vital elements of growth and transformation. To reject the withered petals would be to reject the very soil that made future blossoms possible. My pain, too, was a necessary ingredient in the unfolding of my being. As the call to prayer echoed softly over the city, I made my way to the mosque. I did not come seeking answers or relief, only the solace of shared presence. The air was fragrant with incense and the murmur of prayers, weaving a tapestry of sound and spirit that held us all. Sitting there among others, I felt a profound kinship, not just with those around me, but with all souls who carry unseen burdens. The barriers between self and other seemed to dissolve, leaving a space filled with compassion and understanding. I felt myself both small and vast, a singular life within the boundless ocean of human experience. Later, standing beneath the stars in the quiet courtyard, the night air cool and fragrant, I pondered the door that had become such a powerful symbol in my heart. Once, it had seemed an insurmountable barrier, locking away peace and light. But now, it appeared as a threshold, inviting, mysterious, alive. I realized acceptance did not erase pain or erase the scars, but it allowed me to walk through that door fully aware, fully open. The promise was not of an easy path, but of passage, from resistance to embrace, from fracture to wholeness. Walking slowly home under the canopy of night, I felt lightness in my step and fullness in my chest. I knelt by the window of my room, hands pressed to the cold stone, and whispered a prayer, not a plea for escape, but a vow of courage. Courage to face the unknown, to meet each moment with openness, to trust the unfolding even when the way was hidden. I did not know what lay ahead, nor did I wish to control it. Instead, I surrendered to the mystery, knowing the door would continue to open, gradually, patiently, tenderly. As I lay down to rest, the darkness wrapped me like a soft cloak. My thoughts drifted to the countless seekers before me, those who had walked similar paths of struggle and acceptance, who had faced their own shadows and found light behind the door. I felt connected to that timeless lineage, bound by the shared experience of embracing life's fullness, the sorrow and the joy intertwined. And as sleep carried me away, I surrendered wholly to the moment, held by the quiet truth that in accepting the troubles given to me, I had found the doorway to a deeper, more expansive life, one where pain and grace dance together in the endless embrace of being itself. The realization that acceptance was not a singular event but a lifelong practice settled deeply into my being like a seed planted in fertile soil. It was not something I could master and then leave behind, but rather a constant companion on the winding road of life, a companion that required patience, tenderness, and above all, unwavering kindness toward myself. I had spent so many years chasing after relief, believing that if I could just find the right words, the right prayers, or the right understanding, then my troubles would dissolve like morning mist. But acceptance whispered a different truth, that suffering does not simply vanish, it transforms when met with an open heart and a willing spirit. The wounds I once sought to hide and forget became, instead, sacred maps, guides pointing the way to the depths of my soul and the vastness of my compassion. Each daybreak found me returning, again and again, to that still inner sanctuary where surrender was not weakness but strength. Sometimes the heaviness of grief would press upon my chest like a physical weight, threatening to smother the fragile light within. Yet, rather than fleeing or struggling against it, I learned to cradle the sorrow gently, to breathe with it, and to give it space to move and speak in its own time. In those moments, my heart felt like a vast ocean, holding storms and calms alike, neither rejecting the waves nor clinging desperately to the surface. I trusted the rhythm of this ocean, that after the fiercest tempest, there would come a lull, after the sharpest wave of pain, a soothing stillness. I recall one particular afternoon, the sky swollen with the threat of rain and the air heavy with the scent of wet earth. Wandering the quiet streets alone, my thoughts restless and tangled, I found myself drawn to a small garden where a solitary fig tree stood, its branches bowed with the weight of ripe fruit. One fig had fallen to the ground, bruised and split open, its luscious sweetness seeping slowly into the soil beneath. I crouched beside it, watching ants gather to carry away this gift, their tiny bodies working together in unhurried purpose. In that simple scene, I saw a mirror of my own journey. Even in brokenness, in falling, there is life. Even in surrender, there is service. How often had I believed that my brokenness made me less worthy, less whole. Yet here was the truth. To be broken was not to be lost, but to be deeply connected to the eternal cycle of renewal. That night, lying beneath a sky sprinkled with countless stars, I reflected once more on the door, the symbol that had come to embody my path. It was no longer a single threshold, but a series of doors, layered one behind another, each inviting me deeper into mystery. Some opened easily, with barely a sound, others creaked loudly, demanding reverence, courage, and patience before they would yield. At times, the doors opened inward, revealing hidden chambers within myself, rooms filled with shadow and light, grief and hope, fear and love. At other times, they opened outward, ushering me into the vast unknown of the world beyond, where uncertainty mingles with possibility. Every door required acceptance, not acceptance of a destination, but acceptance of the journey itself, with all its twists and turns. In the days that followed, I sought out companionship with fellow travelers, friends, seekers, those who carried their own burdens and stories. Through shared stories and silent listening, I witnessed the many faces of struggle, anger, despair, hope, and resilience. Beneath these emotions, however, I discerned a shared thread, the universal yearning for freedom from suffering, the deep longing to find peace amidst life's chaos. I spoke little in these gatherings, choosing instead to hold space for the pain and presence of others. I learned that acceptance cannot be rushed or forced. It must be lived, moment by moment, breath by breath, in the quiet spaces between words. One evening, as firelight flickered and shadows danced upon the walls, I traced the lines of my own face in the glow. The years had etched their story upon me, the triumphs and trials, the joys and sorrows. I thought of all the doors I had encountered, those opened with ease and those that had taken years to unlock. Each had shaped me, softened me, revealed fragments of myself I had never dared to see before. Gratitude welled up within me, a deep and tender thanks not only for the blessings but also for the hardships that had led me to this place of deeper understanding and compassion. Acceptance, I realized with growing clarity, was not surrender to fate or defeat but an act of profound courage and freedom. It meant standing fully in the midst of life's mysteries, embracing the full spectrum of experience without retreat or denial. It was the opening of the heart to both light and shadow, recognizing that one could not exist without the other. And in that radical opening, the door did not merely creak ajar, it blossomed wide, inviting the soul into the boundless dance of existence, where joy and sorrow entwine in an endless embrace. As I closed my eyes that night, a deep and abiding peace settled over me, not the fleeting peace of escape, but the enduring peace of presence and surrender. I knew the troubles I carried would continue to visit me, as they do all who journey through this life. But with each moment of acceptance, each breath of surrender, the door opened a little wider still. And within that widening space, I found the courage to step forward, into the unknown, into the mystery, into the grace that waits beyond all fear and resistance. The path of acceptance slowly revealed itself to me as a sacred journey, a daily unfolding that required a patience deeper than any I had known before, a kindness toward myself that felt both foreign and urgently necessary. I came to see that acceptance was not the simple giving up of resistance, nor was it a passive resignation to whatever life presented. Rather, it was a profound, active engagement with reality exactly as it was, the joy and the sorrow woven together like threads in a tapestry, inseparable and whole. To truly accept meant to open my heart fully, to meet even the darkest corners of my experience without flinching or turning away. This radical openness demanded a courage I had not anticipated, the courage to face my own vulnerabilities, to embrace the wounds I had hidden in shame, fear, or denial. Each morning, as the sun slowly ascended and the shadows that clung to the edges of the world softened and receded, I found myself more deeply attuned to the subtle rhythms within me. The troubles that once appeared as towering mountains, impossible to surmount, began to transform into gentle hills, challenges that could be met with grace and perseverance. I learned to listen, not with the restless mind that sought answers or escape, but with the quiet presence of the soul. I listened to the soft whisperings of pain that no words could fully capture, the deep murmurings of longing that stretched beyond the known, and the silent language of hope that glimmered faintly even in the darkest moments. Sitting in the stillness of dawn, I allowed myself to be present to whatever arose within me. Sometimes it was grief, heavy and thick like a fog. Other times, it was a fragile peace, delicate as the unfolding of a blossom at first light. I welcomed both without judgment, understanding that one could not exist without the other, that sorrow and peace were two sides of the same coin, the necessary companions on the journey of being human. One particular afternoon remained vivid in my memory. The sky was laden with heavy clouds, pregnant with the promise of rain, and the air hung thick with the scent of wet earth and blooming flowers. I walked alone beside a gently flowing river, watching the water as it moved steadily over smooth stones, bending around obstacles with neither haste nor hesitation. The current carried fallen leaves and twigs downstream, reflecting the shifting moods of the sky above. In that flowing water, I saw a mirror of my own path, an unending movement forward, a graceful acceptance of change and loss, a trust in the unseen guidance of the current. Just as the river embraced every stone, every branch, shaping itself in response without resistance, so too was I learning to accept the contours of my life, including its moments of pain, uncertainty, and seeming chaos. The river taught me that to flow with life was not to be passive, but to be resilient, flexible, and profoundly alive. As night fell and the stars emerged, scattered like diamonds across the deep velvet sky, I sat alone in my chamber, contemplating the many doors that life had set before me. Each door held a unique lesson. Some opened easily, welcoming me into light and possibility. Others resisted stubbornly, demanding patience, humility, and a quiet reverence. I realized then that acceptance was not about forcing doors open or rushing through them with impatience. It was about waiting with an open heart, ready to step forward when the time was right, trusting in the timing of life's unfolding. Surrendering to the mystery, rather than clinging to control, became an act of profound faith and freedom. In the company of friends and fellow seekers, I found solace and strength in shared stories of suffering and resilience. We spoke not only of pain but of the moments of grace that emerge unexpectedly, acts of kindness, sudden insights, quiet strengths that blossom in the darkest soil. These conversations reminded me that acceptance was not a solitary endeavor but a communal journey, a sacred dance of human connection. Each of us carried our own doors and troubles, learning to open our hearts despite the fear, doubt, and uncertainty that accompanied the passage. In the presence of others, I discovered a deeper compassion, not only for them but for the broken, struggling parts of myself. One evening, as firelight flickered and cast moving shadows on the walls of my room, I traced the contours of my own face, marked by years of joy and sorrow, courage and doubt. I thought of every door I had faced, those that had opened readily and those that had taken years to unlock. Each had shaped me, softened me, and revealed fragments of myself I had never dared to see. Gratitude welled within me, a deep and tender thanks not only for blessings received but for the hardships endured, hardships that had guided me to a place of profound understanding and compassion. Acceptance, I came to see, was not an act of surrender to fate or defeat but a bold declaration of freedom and courage. It was standing fully in the heart of life's mysteries, embracing the entire spectrum of experience without retreat or denial. It was the opening of the heart to both light and shadow, recognizing that one cannot exist without the other. In this radical opening, the door did not merely creak ajar, it blossomed wide, inviting the soul into the boundless dance of existence, where joy and sorrow entwine in an eternal embrace. As I closed my eyes that night, a profound peace settled upon me, not the fleeting peace of escape but the enduring peace of presence and surrender. I knew that the troubles I carried would continue to visit me, as they do all who walk this earthly path. Yet, with each moment of acceptance, each breath surrendered to the flow, the door opened wider still. And within that widening space, I found the courage to step forward, into the unknown, into the mystery, into the grace that awaits beyond fear and resistance, beckoning me home to the fullness of life itself. There came a moment in my life when the weight I carried, the troubles, sorrows, and doubts, no longer felt like a burden to bear alone, but rather like a sacred invitation to a deeper understanding of existence and myself. This realization did not come suddenly, like a lightning strike, but unfolded gradually and gently, like the first light of dawn spreading softly across the horizon after a long night. It was as though the very ground beneath me had softened, no longer forcing me to resist its pull with clenched fists, but instead allowing me to sink gently into its embrace, to feel the subtle vibrations of life beneath my feet. I began to see that the pains and hardships I had endured were not walls blocking my path, but doors waiting to be opened, thresholds leading me into new realms of awareness, grace, and transformation. This shift, subtle yet profound, became a turning point, a sacred opening in the fabric of my being. In those still, quiet hours before dawn, when the world seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of the coming day, I would sit in meditation, turning my gaze inward with a gentle curiosity. It was here, in the silence, that I learned to welcome the full spectrum of my experience without flinching, embracing light and shadow, joy and sorrow, certainty and doubt as inseparable threads woven into the tapestry of life. Acceptance was no longer an abstract concept, but an embodied practice, a deep listening and surrendering to the flow of existence exactly as it was in that moment. In this surrender, I discovered a strange and liberating freedom, a release from the relentless striving, the futile battles waged within my heart against what simply was. To accept was not to surrender defeat, but to embrace fully, to hold every fragment of myself with tenderness and compassion, even those parts one had once deemed unworthy or broken. One afternoon, wandering through a grove of ancient trees, their gnarled roots burrowing deep into the earth, I was drawn to the forest floor, where a thick carpet of dead leaves lay in silent testament to the cycle of life and death. The leaves were dry and brittle, their vibrant greens faded into gentle browns and golds, yet they nourished the soil beneath and protected the roots that sustained the towering trees above. I found myself humbled by the wisdom of this natural process, the way the trees relinquished their leaves each season, not as loss but as a sacred letting go that made room for renewal and growth. In that moment, I recognized a mirror held up to my own soul. Just as the trees shed their leaves, so too must I learn to release the parts of myself that no longer serve my highest good, the old fears, regrets, attachments, and wounds that weighed heavily upon my spirit. This shedding was not an act of loss but of transformation, a necessary shedding that allowed me to grow stronger, more resilient, and more fully alive. That evening, Beneath a sky dusted with countless stars, I sat in the quiet of my chamber, contemplating the many doors I had encountered throughout my journey. Some had opened with effortless grace, welcoming me into light and possibility. Others had resisted stubbornly, demanding the gifts of patience, courage, humility, and unwavering faith. I understood deeply then that acceptance was not a fixed destination but an ongoing, ever-deepening process, a continual surrender to the unfolding mystery of life. Each door I opened led to another, inviting me to step beyond the boundaries of my limited self and into the vastness of being. This journey was not always easy or comfortable. At times, it required facing the shadows within, my fears, doubts, and vulnerabilities that I had long hidden away. Yet, in confronting these shadows, I found an unexpected strength, a resilience born not from resistance but from the gentle power of surrender. In my moments of solitude and silence, I became increasingly aware of a greater wisdom flowing through me, a quiet, persistent guiding presence that held me steady through storms and calm alike. It was a presence both tender and fierce, reminding me that acceptance opens the heart to boundless compassion, not only for others but also, and perhaps most importantly, for oneself. This compassion softened the harsh judgments and self-condemnations I had carried for so long and invited me into a loving relationship with all aspects of my being, my imperfections, wounds, fears, and hopes. It was as if I was learning, finally, to cradle my own soul with the same gentle care I had so often extended to others. As I lay down to rest each night, wrapped in the quiet embrace of darkness, I felt an immense peace washing over me, a peace not born of escape or avoidance but of true presence and surrender. The door that once appeared daunting and impenetrable now stood wide open, inviting me into the fullness of existence with all its mystery, complexity, and beauty. I understood, with a heart wide open, that walking through this door meant living fully, loving deeply, suffering openly, and embracing completely. Every moment, whether bathed in light or shadow, was a sacred gift, a step along the endless path of awakening and becoming. In this profound acceptance, I found not a conclusion but a beginning, a door that would continue to open again and again, revealing new vistas of understanding, compassion, and grace. With every breath, every step, I moved closer to the radiant heart of life itself, where all opposites dissolve and the soul dances freely in the eternal embrace of being. The final unfolding of this journey of acceptance felt like the quiet settling of a long, restless sea into a calm, endless expanse, where every ripple, every wave, finally found its place within the vastness. It was a realization that acceptance was not a single event, a momentary epiphany, but an ongoing, ever-deepening awakening, one that expanded and softened my heart with every breath, every heartbeat, and every encounter with the endless mystery of life. This acceptance was not an act of surrender in weakness, nor a passive resignation to fate. Rather, it was a profound and courageous act, a willingness to stand fully, unflinchingly, in the truth of my existence, to welcome both the light and the shadow with reverence and grace. It was the opening of a door I once feared, a threshold that no longer separated me from peace but led me home to myself, to the quiet center within, and to the infinite that dwells beyond all understanding. Sitting quietly in the soft stillness of the early morning, the air fragrant with earth and jasmine, I reflected on the winding, often arduous path that had brought me to this place of openness. The hardships and sorrows that had once threatened to shatter me had not done so. Instead, they had carved deep hollows within my heart, hollows spacious enough to hold boundless compassion, deep wisdom, and an unshakable peace that no external circumstance could disturb. I saw clearly now that every trial, every moment of despair, every tear shed in silence had been a sacred teacher. Every wound had become a door, every sorrow a river flowing steadily toward healing, growth, and wholeness. This acceptance I had nurtured was not a denial of pain, nor a wish to erase it. Rather, it was a full invitation to embrace life in its complexity, trusting that within that wholeness lay the key to true freedom. I remembered vividly the times I had fought fiercely against my troubles, clinging desperately to illusions of control, struggling against the currents of change, denying my own suffering as if by doing so I could make it disappear. How exhausting that resistance had been, how isolating and futile. But through the practice of acceptance, I came to learn the paradoxical power of yielding without giving up, of bending without breaking. Like the reed that sways gently and gracefully in the wind's embrace, I discovered a resilience born not from rigidity but from softness, an ability to flow with the rhythms of existence while remaining deeply rooted in the soil of being. Living now with this newfound acceptance transformed every moment of my life. Joy was no longer fragile or fleeting, tethered to external conditions, but vibrant and full-bodied, blooming from the fertile soil of presence. Sorrow no longer overwhelmed me, for I met it with gentleness and compassion rather than denial or avoidance. My relationships deepened, not because they were free from imperfection, but because I showed up fully, with all my wounds, fears, hopes, and love. And in embracing my own troubles, I found myself able to hold space for the struggles of others, extending compassion without judgment, without impatience. This interconnectedness wove a delicate yet strong tapestry of shared humanity, reminding me that none of us truly walk alone on this journey. One evening, beneath a sky blazing with the vibrant colors of sunset, crimson melting into gold, fading into twilight blue, I sat quietly by the river's edge. The water flowed steadily and unhurriedly, carrying leaves and light alike on its endless journey toward the sea. I saw in its ceaseless movement a mirror of my own life, ever-changing, ever-flowing, never still for long. And yet within this constant flow was something enduring, the deep presence of acceptance, the unwavering openness of the heart that held all things tenderly. I realized in that moment that this was the true door, the door that leads beyond fear, beyond resistance, beyond the illusion of separation, into the vast and boundless embrace of love, being, and unity. As darkness gently enfolded me, the stars beginning their silent vigil overhead, I felt an immense wave of gratitude rising within my soul. The troubles that had once seemed unbearable and insurmountable were now the very keys that had unlocked the door to deeper understanding, profound compassion, and enduring peace. I understood at last that acceptance was not a final destination or a conclusion, but the beginning of an eternal journey, one without end or final arrival. Each step forward opened a new door, each door revealed fresh vistas of insight, grace, and awakening. With every breath and every moment, I moved ever closer to the radiant heart of life itself, where all dualities dissolve and the soul dances freely in the eternal embrace of being. Lying down to rest, surrendering completely to the night, to the silence, to the vast and infinite unknown, I held the steady knowing that whatever tomorrow might bring, joy or sorrow, certainty or doubt, I would meet it with an open heart and a calm, steady spirit. For the moment I truly accepted the troubles given to me, the door did not merely open once, it remained forever ajar, a gentle invitation that called me always to step through into the boundless light of presence, love, and grace, a place where all wounds are healed, all fears dissolved, and the soul rests in the peace of eternal belonging.